Welcome to The Value of One, the Power of All, a podcast created by the Ron Brown Scholar Program. Since 1996, this organization has been investing in the next generation of African American leaders, and this podcast highlights the stories of the scholars, alumni, staff, and friends that make this program special. This is your host, Ray Pryor, 2015 Ron Brown Scholar, and you're listening to the second episode of the second season, focused on the impact and insights on the public sector from the Ron Brown community. In high school, I participated in We the People, the Citizen, and the Constitution, or what we refer to as Con Law. It was a student competition where we spent hours and hours virtually memorizing the United States Constitution, landmark Supreme Court cases, and the history and inner workings of the American government and political system. And then we used all of this knowledge to back legal arguments on present-day issues in front of a panel of judges. You can imagine mock trial meets speech and debate, meets Model UN, meets what felt like the academic intensity of being in your 1L year. I was reciting lines of John Locke's two treatises of government and the Articles of Confederation and the Federalist Papers, so much so that I was shushed, adding my own commentary as I watched Hamilton for the first time. I know, it's really nerdy stuff. It was a training ground for students like myself at the time who were aspiring lawyers, and we did it, not because we cared so much about politics or candidates and the political games often played by the legislative and executive branches of government, although we knew that stuff mattered, but I was really fascinated by the judicial branch and wanted to understand the power of the courts. Episode 1 highlighted the lessons I learned from talking to Ron Brown scholars who have run for legislative offices. But this episode is going to take a deep dive into the scholars who serve or have served as attorneys to uphold the integrity of our legal system. In episode 1, I asked both of the former political candidates, Chaz Beasley, 2004 Ron Brown Scholar, and Morgan Harper, 2001 Ron Brown Scholar, of all the things you could do, why run for elected office? The guests on this episode have the same curse, with having nearly unlimited options to make a difference in the world. But somehow, they all landed on what they know is their calling as lawyers, at least the one that they're living into for now. I asked them to share what inspired them to pursue a career in public service. Here's what they said right after this message. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Value of One, the Power of All. Whether you're a longtime supporter or a new friend of the Ron Brown Scholar Program, we're glad you're here. When I started putting together the conversations that became this podcast, it had been years since the Ron Brown community had been able to gather in person. So I wanted to create a platform where we could hold, capture, be inspired by, and be challenged by the discourse that occurs within the Ron Brown community and make it accessible to anyone, anywhere, at any time. And now it's become much bigger than I originally imagined, but it's still only a fraction of its full potential. So if you're a loyal listener who wants to donate to help us make the next evolution of this podcast happen, send me a note at info@ronbrown.org, and I'll share our vision for what this can become. All right, back to the episode. Bradley Pough is a 2008 Ron Brown Scholar who works in the Attorney General's office at the Department of Justice. He's originally from New York by way of Florida. He went to Yale for undergrad and then Harvard for law school. When I asked him what originally turned him onto the path of becoming a lawyer, he brought up an inspiring experience being a part of a campaign for Florida's Attorney General.
He had this kind of refrain as he was running. I don't know if you'll remember, but that was 2010. It was right after the BP oil spill. You know, in the Gulf, we were right there. We were constantly engaging with communities who had been impacted directly by this oil spill. Businesses who had to shut down for the summer because nobody was coming. You know, homes that were damaged. You know, the whole thing. And you know, he had this refrain whenever he spoke to people impacted by that spill. He'd say, you know, BP and the businesses like it, they have their lawyers. I want to run to be your lawyer. And he would talk about the way that as the Attorney General, he had all of these powers, that he would have all of these powers to help to redress the wrongs that had happened to them. And these were people that otherwise weren't going to be able to afford a lawyer. These are people who, you know, the law was something that happened to them. It wasn't something that they availed themselves of, but this was a guy who was running to be their lawyer. And as I watched the way that that light turned on in their heads as he was explaining to them what the attorney general did. I was like, oh, the law is a really powerful tool for justice, for service, for community impact. And like watching the way that he was planning on using it, he didn't end up winning, unfortunately, but watching the way that he was planning on using it, I think it was ultimately what convinced me, this is a righteous route. This is something that I'd like to do.
Growing up, you always hear stories about how crucial the law was to the civil rights movement and how lawyers were at the forefront of the fight for equality and justice. 2017, lawyers played a big role on a different battleground that hit close to home for another Ron Brown scholar.
And it was very powerful to see that some of the people on the front lines were lawyers. Like, there were all these groups of lawyers going to airports to meet people and to help them in whatever way they could.
That's Azeezat Adeleke, 2013 Ron Brown scholar, who's originally from Maryland, went to Yale for undergrad, Stanford for law school, and now works in a Muslim family. So the executive order known as the Muslim ban sparked her to pursue a career in the legal field.
It's like these battles were not really fought on a political stage. I mean, they were, but the more effective fight happened in the courts. And I think that for me was a big lesson in saying, okay, who are the people who really have some power to still help people? It was the lawyers. So I think that was a big light bulb moment for me to say, okay, what's some ways you can still maintain some sense of power to help uphold the rule of law? Maybe it means going to law school.
One of the most prestigious roles that a baby lawyer from a top law school can get is a judicial clerkship. And to no surprise, several Ron Brown scholars have secured this career-minting opportunity shortly after law school. Azeezat clerked in the Southern District of New York, a place that has emerged as kind of a magnet for Ron Brown scholars in the legal profession, as clerks, attorneys, and even congressmen. So I asked her, what exactly do clerks do?
Clerking is a really amazing job because you are basically like the right hand to a judge. And a lot of what you do is actually writing opinions. So you get to write in the voice of the court and help the judge decide how cases come out. So I was a law clerk in the Southern District of New York for a year. Usually these last for a year. And it's an amazing job to have out of law school because you really get to see how litigation works in real life.
Bradley used an interesting analogy to describe his clerking experience.
Every day I tried to kind of embody that, like I tried to climb into his head because that's ultimately what we were doing. We were, like kind of little ghostwriters for this like legal giant, and you had to both embody like his style of writing and his legal philosophy, but also like his philosophy of government and like why he did the job that he did. And it was hard. We'd have some opinions where we'd hit draft 90, 92, 93, and month after month working on that same opinion. There was one opinion that I got the day I inherited it from somebody who was doing the clerkship before me. It was on my desk the day I arrived, and we published it maybe 3 or 4 weeks before my clerkship ended. And we hit draft 120 or something like that. And it was just because he cared so deeply about getting every word right.
Kelsey Miller took a less traditional path to the clerkship she's doing right now. She's a 2012 Ron Brown scholar from Maryland who went to Yale for undergrad and Harvard for law school. But rather than going straight into her clerkship after law school, she spent 2 years working on voting rights cases for the ACLU.
After law school, there's now kind of this idea of there are so many set paths that people can take. A lot of people go to firms directly after. A lot of people clerk directly after. So I have plenty of friends who've already done what I'm doing now. And there are some people like me who either directly go into a fellowship or just a full-time job in the law as a practicing attorney. I at least knew for me at a given point, having done a few clinics in law school and some volunteer opportunities in law school working directly with clients, I just kind of needed to learn by doing for a little bit. I felt like at a given point in law school, that's where I really started synergizing what I was learning. I wouldn't say that I'm just 100% a learning by doing person and I don't like being in the classroom because I do. But it was always best when I could map it onto something that I was actually physically doing and working on. And so I felt a real appetite and energy around wanting to work for a little bit before I clerked. And clerking is a little bit more of an academic experience. A lot of people say that there's kind of a harmony between clerking and being in the law school setting, which I think is true. And I kind of wanted to be able to, if I'm going to clerk, I wanted to be able to come back to it with a little bit more intentionality about what I'm going to learn from it. I was now at the point where I felt like I could really get something out of clerking by zooming out. You know, I had been working on the same set of issues with the same group of people for the 2 years. And, you know, while maybe I would go back to doing voting work again, but maybe I won't. There are many other issues that I care about, areas that I might want to work in, other places I might want to work in. But I should at least give myself a chance to zoom out and see what it means to be a practicing lawyer, an effective practicing lawyer on a variety of different issues, and also be able to work with a judge who has a much more experience and perspective about which ways work. And that's how I ended up kind of doing this timing of working first and clerking after. And I think that was the right thing for me. I was grateful to at least have a working environment that I knew I was going to be in for the 2 years, where I would be able to grow and would be a positive experience. But I think that sequence allows me to go into this job with way more intentionality about the skills that I want to build and the exposure that I want to have. And at least for this year, I'm in district court, so I'm seeing a lot of trials, way more trials than I could possibly have worked on in the 2 years at ACLU. Now, next year, when I'm doing appellate work, that'll be a little bit more new to me, just because, you know, we worked on some briefs, but not many of our cases were on appeal at the time that I was a fellow on the Voting Rights Project. So doing appeals work all the time, that'll allow me to better appreciate not only what I was working on at ACLU, because our, you know, cases go on appeal all the time there, but also what I'm doing now. You know, things on appeal are the result of things that are very similar to what I'm doing now, the trials that we're having and the motions that we're ruling on. So it's kind of like playing in a game, and now I'm the referee on the side, trying to figure out how it all works. And, you know, I'd like to think that it's building towards some grand wisdom of some sort, but, you know, ask me in a year and we'll see.
Morgan didn't necessarily think clerking right after law school was right up her alley either, but she embraced the opportunity to clerk in her home state of Ohio.
Well, the thing about it that was very much up my alley is making calls on what's right or wrong. And you know, I had previously worked in Washington before going to law school, so I had had a taste of, you know, a very brief stint in government at that point, and working just in the political arena. And I knew that public service was where my heart was at. And so the clerkship is just this incredible opportunity and responsibility as someone who's fairly young, to be handed the keys to somebody's life, you know, and not, you know, usually when, or at least in the courtroom where I was, we weren't really handling a lot of criminal cases. The judge would keep the criminal cases, but we were handling civil litigation where it's like, are you guilty? Are you innocent? Is somebody going to have to pay somebody some money? What's the deal? And that was just a big responsibility. It kind of hits you. It's like, wow, okay, this person has sued their insurance company, which is, you know, one case that comes to mind, sued their insurance company because they didn't think that they got the right benefits under their plan. Who's right? Who wins? You know, and keeping that decision making. And moving along. And I remember just thinking, like, oh my God, they're just gonna let me take the first cut of deciding, you know, who's right in this. But I immediately felt that responsibility. It's like, all right, well, I've got to really like dig into these cases, understand the law, and make sure that we're coming out on the right side of things, because this is going to be, you know, for both parties, of course, when you're in the judiciary, it's not that you're biased towards one side or the other, but for somebody, you know, who's getting their day in court and who's trying to go up against an insurance company, you do realize that is a huge process, and honoring and respecting all that they've been through to make sure that you're reaching the right conclusion and making that recommendation to the judge. So it's great training because ultimately, as you continue to move in your career, it's just more and more big decisions to be made. And especially if you're in public service, those decisions usually have implications far beyond yourself or just a good, a product, or a service. It's about how society is operating. And the clerkship's a really good opportunity to start getting used to utilizing that skill set and developing it and becoming comfortable with making the right call and just taking the information in and trying to figure out what we should do to move forward.
There's a reason why clerkships are often reserved for the best of the best baby lawyers. It's an intense job.
Legal work is not easy. It is pretty complex, and it's hard to rush through the type of reading and thinking and analyzing that you have to do when you're involved in any sort of legal work, really, but especially in the clerkship. I mean, not every legal job involves reading and writing all day long, but that's what a clerkship is for sure. And making sure that you're giving that the proper time and attention. So clerkships, it's very common in clerkships that you're working most weekends, just to be able to get the chunks of time to really think deeply and process all that information, because during the week you still have a whole docket. So there might be a trial going on. There might be, one of your cases has a hearing and you have to be present in the courtroom with the judge. And so then that breaks up your day. So really to find those chunks of time, the weekends often become when you do that. What I've learned now I'm not so much a baby lawyer. In some ways, I'm not even totally a lawyer really practicing so much anymore, but I am barred. But what I've learned though is, that experience starts to just build up that stamina for that type of thinking and that type of writing. And once you have it, you can keep it and you just keep applying it. And so, even though I'm not doing as much practicing of law now, 15 years in or almost into, after law school now, I still apply those same skills about, all right, this is how I'm going to churn through a lot of content, a lot of thinking, the different types of thinking you have to do, creating those blocks of time to do it. So yeah, I think that the clerkship, regardless of what type of law you think you want to do, is a really good experience and good training to set you up for the rest of your career.
Bradley had similar reflections on his time clerking for the First Circuit Court of Appeals.
Yeah, I mean, it was a really powerful experience. I loved my clerkship, and a significant reason why I loved my clerkship was because I loved my judge. I clerked for Judge David Barron on the First Circuit up in Boston. And he's just a public servant's public servant. He cares first and foremost about government, about the institutions of government, about making sure they're operating fairly, justly. That the promise of government is being borne out in everything that we do. And he worked for the Department of Justice in the Obama administration. He was a professor at Harvard Law School, and just watching the way he was almost like he was pulled out of like a different era, because he's pretty young. He was an Obama appointee, so he's not like one of these older judges. I thought he was going to be in a lot of ways he is a contemporary and a peer, and in so many ways. But his philosophy about government felt like pulled from a different era. Government and service ought to be independent of politics. In particular, the judiciary is like this kind of inviolable institution that politics shouldn't come into here. We are really trying to call balls and strikes and live up to the kind of majesty of the law that you're taught in law school, but at some point gets kind of beaten out of you. And it never got beaten out of him. He always believed in the majesty of the law in everything that we did. And so, it was really exciting to get to learn from him. And you're right, we had a ton of responsibility. It was me and 3 other clerks, all of us directly out of law school. Judge Barron would have us draft all the opinions in the first instance and then work over the course of months, sometimes years, to perfect that opinion. He never let an opinion go out the door until every word was perfect in his mind. And what that meant was, like, it was the most intense legal education that I ever had, writing education that I ever had, education that I ever had, because every day I'd go into the office with him after I had drafted, for first draft of opinion. We'd go in and we'd sit and we'd talk through every single sentence. What did you mean by this word? Why are we using this over this? Why are we citing to this case instead of this case? Have you thought about it this way, and how would that reshape the opinion? Are we addressing, and this was always something that he cared so deeply about, are we addressing the arguments of the person who is least empowered in this case? He's like, maybe we're going to decide against them. The law just might not be on our side, but I want them to know that we heard them, that the arguments that they put in their briefs were heard and responded to, because this may be one of the few interactions that they have with the judiciary. And I want them to walk away feeling like, even if it didn't go the way that they wanted, that it went in a just manner.
Here's Azeezat sharing her experience.
You get to see cases go from start to finish. You get to resolve all the intermediary questions between the start and finish, like motion to dismiss, motion for summary judgment, and then trial. So in my case, I saw 2 trials. The most interesting one was a criminal trial of a couple people who were charged with immigration fraud. So basically, like, helping people submit false claims for asylum by lying about whether they were part of a protected group. So I got to sit in trial every day for almost 2 weeks and see the government present its case. Sometimes there might be legal issues that happen during the trial, and I would quickly do research and give the judge my best opinion about how he should rule on one of those smaller legal issues. And then I got to help craft the jury instructions. So this is like a 40-page document instructing the jury about how to think about each of the small issues to help them reach their verdict. And then at the end, there was a verdict, and it was really amazing to feel like that was a really big part of that trial happening. So that's a big part of what you do. Then there's writing the opinions, and then there's the managing of caseload. So in the Southern District of New York, a judge might have like 400 cases at a time, and he has about 3 law clerks. So I had my little portion of those cases, and my job was to help make sure that every single day, each of those cases was moving through from the beginning to the end. As anyone who goes to law school knows, or anyone in general knows, these cases might last for a year, they might last for 5 years, 10 years. So you're the one who's there every day, making sure these things are slowly moving forward toward being resolved, either through getting tossed out of court, going to trial, or all the way through to settlement. So yeah, I mean, as a baby lawyer, it's an amazing way to feel like you're putting all the lessons from law school to good use and seeing what it's really like to be out there. It's also a great confidence booster because often, let's say you join a law firm, you might be the most junior person in a law firm and get work that isn't really giving you the full picture, or work where you have like no authority and you're just like being told to like look at a bunch of documents or do a little research project. So being a law clerk, you just have so much more of a bird's eye view over a case, and also a lot more authority to give the judge advice on what happens. At least in my case, my judge was very receptive to listening to his clerks, so he would really take our opinion seriously if we understood how an issue should come out or had a good sense of which side was right or wrong. So I think having all of that authority just gave me a big confidence boost in my own abilities as a lawyer, my gut instincts, my opinions, my approach. So for me, it's a great way to start out.
All of this sounded like a lot of power and responsibility to give to someone who just finished law school. I asked them how it felt carrying the weight of the law at such an early stage in their careers.
It's funny because I feel like I've felt that in every single job I've ever had, to some degree. Like, why am I in charge of any of this, or why am I even just like a little ripple in the big effect that any of this is going to have when you zoom out? I don't think it totally hit me in the job until kind of the first time you have a court proceeding and, your judge goes out and you kind of see what it means for, a judge to come in, everyone stands, they say, please be seated, everyone sits, presides over everything. And that's when it really hits you. we had a naturalization ceremony within the first month of the job, which is still one of my favorite days that I've ever had at this job. All of these people come in and, they're about to be naturalized. They've come with their families, and you see how happy they are. And, this is 30 minutes to 45 minutes of my day. It's on my calendar. It's by all intents and purposes, an administrative thing in my work day. But that's going to change those people's lives in terms of what they'll now be able to do in their daily lives with their families, at their jobs, et cetera, in our system of now being able to say that they're U.S. citizens. That means something legally. That happened administratively, not in large part because of me, but I was there, and that's how a lot of it feels. I think if you've been working in the public sector and public service for a long time, it's important to kind of not take that for granted. I think sometimes that can be part of DC culture. It's like everyone's so used to being in these jobs that you can kind of forget that aspect. I think anyone can in any job, but I think it's pretty pronounced in jobs of these types. I guess I just try to not let it completely overwhelm me, because otherwise I wouldn't be able to do the work every day. It helps that, talking with my coworkers, talking with my judge, I think it's really helpful to make these issues less abstract. We have a specific case in front of us that we're talking about. So, you can kind of ground yourself in that, and in the human aspect of working on it with people and trying to get it right. I think that's the focus that we have every day. So yeah, it can be sobering. I think no matter who you are, how old you are, how young you are, I see people come into the courtroom, and it can be a little bit overwhelming having the power to make those decisions. I don't have it. I just help someone else exercise it. But nonetheless, what we do does have an impact on everyone else, and it's hard to forget that. But I think that is the divorce between the Outlook calendar, for example, and the everyday that I really do try to be conscious of.
The range of issues that the judge has before them is just so vast. So things that would really directly affect people were cases like, we had a lot of wage and hour violation cases in New York. There are these minimum wage laws, and then there's the federal wage and hour laws too. So one of my trials was for a Chinese food delivery man who was not being paid properly by his bosses at this restaurant. Like, it's a very small case, nothing glamorous. It was just the guy and his lawyer, and then the lawyer for the restaurant, where the clients didn't even show up. It was just the lawyer. So like a tiny case. The trial lasted like a day and a half, but this man was able to testify in front of a jury and explain that he was owed like tens of thousands of dollars in back wages. And the jury was convinced, and he won the case. And so the ability for just a small case to really impact someone's life is pretty amazing. And that was an example of feeling like, okay, the court really is making a difference. And it's not just big corporations that are here fighting it out. These cases also affect everyday people. And then another big bucket of cases were criminal defense cases. So in New York, a lot of these cases are for the possession of drugs, or more so actually is to say, a lot of these cases were for the distribution and sale of drugs, especially now there's the fentanyl crisis. So a lot of people were brought in for selling other drugs like heroin, for example, that was laced with fentanyl. And basically everything you read about the drug war would be there in the courtroom, right? So a lot of these were like young men who were part of a gang and maybe sold a kind of small quantity of drugs, mostly because they had various economic or family issues. So on one side, I have a lot of sympathy. On the other side, there is the fact that fentanyl is a very harmful substance, even in small quantities, that has really devastated a lot of communities. And on the other hand, you have the government's long war on drugs, which has not been very effective or fruitful. And you can say, okay, sentencing people to really harsh sentences for selling small amounts of drugs doesn't work. But at the same time, we do need to discourage people from selling drugs on the street because it has such a harmful impact on their communities. And so trying to manage all of those competing factors while seeing a person sitting in the courtroom who is about to be sentenced, and my job, of course, was not to sentence them. So that's the judge's job. But my job was to give an opinion, to read all the documents and say, okay, here's what I think is a sentence that would adhere to all the principles of fairness, justice, and also making sure that this person doesn't do the same thing again. So I think that's an example where the court feels very close to people's lives. There are many times in a sentencing where the defendant would speak and talk about what brought them to that place. We'd hear from their family. We might hear from the prosecutor about the effect that their actions had. And those were the hardest days because it was so close to someone's life. But there are so many big picture factors to consider.
Most of the guests on this episode, at some point in their careers, either before or after law school, worked in the private sector. But for Bradley in particular, his transition from big law to the White House and subsequently to the Department of Justice was representative of a bit of a constant push and pull that every Ron Brown scholar has to navigate in their career.
Yeah. It was a really weird time, right? Like 2020 was wild. um, at the time, I was working at a law firm. I was working at a big law firm in DC, and I didn't mind it, especially when I went initially, pre-COVID. It was decent. I get to go into the office, met a lot of new people, working on exciting stuff. And then COVID happens, and everything shuts down, and I'm working, in my small apartment in DC, crazy hours, cases and matters like representing like telecom companies, like just like stuff that like I was like, did I really go to law school for this? But whatever. And then the murder of George Floyd happens, right in the middle of COVID, and all of my friends and my peer group, they're out, they're in the streets, they're protesting, they're speaking out, and I'm working like 15-hour days for telecom companies, and and I'm like this isn't right. Like something's off. Like this is not the best use of my skills. This is not the best use of my time. Like I didn't go to law school to miss this moment. We are in the middle of historic health crisis, a racial reckoning, in a political moment that we've never seen before, and I'm representing telecom companies, and I'm like, I gotta figure out a way to do something else. I started like just kind of like casting like applications out to like state and local government and like nonprofits, and none of it seemed right. And then a partner who I was working for calls me up. She had worked in the Obama administration. She had ties to the Biden team and what have you. And she's like, look, I have an opportunity. The Biden transition team, this is before the election. This is the campaign's still going on. She's like, it's the summer of 2020. The Biden transition team is standing up. They're going to start thinking about selecting a vice president. And to do that, they've got to vet all of the possible options. They're going to have like 12 to 15 different options that they're going to consider, and they're going to have to do like deep dives into them. But they don't have a staff yet to do that vetting. So they come to law firms and they ask the law firms to volunteer, their time to do the kind of background checks and interviews of the candidates who are like potential vice presidential nominees for the transition team. So this partner comes to me and she's like, they've asked us to be one of the law firms. I'm putting together a team of folks who was going to help with this, and I'd like you to be on the team. But first, this isn't part of your work for the law firm. You don't get paid for this. And she's like, 2, this also isn't pro bono. So you can't even like mark down that you're doing it. And 3, you actually can't tell anyone until this is done that you're involved in this program, other than the people that are working on it. It's that secret. So you've got to do all the 15 hours of work that you were previously doing for me, to continue to let this firm run. That still has to happen. And then in the gaps in your free time, you work on this initiative vetting vice presidential candidates. She's like, you don't have to, but if you want to, options open. And I'm a bit of a masochist, so I'm like, yeah, that sounds awesome. Let's do it. So it's like July of 2020, and I couldn't even tell my now wife. I didn't tell her what I was doing. I was just working around the clock. Like, I'd log off from the law firm at like 10, and then for the next like 4 to 6 hours, I was like grinding on this vetting project. And I wouldn't go to bed until 3 a.m., wake up again at like 8 or 9 and like do it all over again for like a month and a half until, we put together our dossier and sent it over to the transition team, and they picked who they picked, and like I was like, I could breathe finally. And then they're like, okay, the transition team comes back to us. They're like, all right, great. Now we've got to do all of the cabinet secretaries, and we're like, oh my god. But that was around August, and at that point they started to get a little bit more money. They started to the transition team became a bit more of a robust institution. And as I'm like doing a little bit of like the first round of vetting for some of these cabinet secretaries, I get a call again from this partner, and she's like, all right, look, she's like, this is a call against interest for her, and she's like, but the transition team has called me about your work, and she's like, they've seen some of the vets that you've done, some of the research that you've done, they really like it, and they want to know if you want to come on to the transition team full time. She's like, it's going to be a huge pay cut, and it's a transition team that is being set up before the election, so if the election doesn't go Biden's way, you got to figure something out. But you're not going to be working for the law firm, and you're not going to be working for the transition team at that point. But she's like, this is how White Houses are built. They bring people into the transition team. You work there. If the election goes your way, then if all things go right, then you get to move into the administration with the president and the vice president. And I was like, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity. This is what I was looking for. This is this is not representing telecom companies. Like, this is the show. And I was like, yeah, like, I'm in. And so it like happened within a week, like Labor Day weekend. I accepted the offer like the Thursday before Labor Day weekend, and like the next following Tuesday, I was working for the transition team, like that. And then again, like that's just for the next 2 months, just churning through like every single political appointee that had to be vetted, and anybody that was Senate confirmed. I was vetting them. I was doing background research on them. I was interviewing them. We were just like in the weeds of these people's lives to make sure that nothing that they had in their background was going to come back to hurt the, then the campaign and ultimately the administration. And so I did that from September until January, and then ultimately got pulled into the White House to continue to do that work for another 6 months. And then it was in July of 2021 when I went over to the vice president's office and worked in that job. But that's how the kind of long path to my White House job.
After the White House, Bradley gets to take this passion for public service to another level.
And so I was very lucky that I found this job at the Department of Justice. I'm working for the Deputy Attorney General on civil rights and prison reform for her, really getting to round out my experience in the administration, because the White House and the agencies are in some ways like very different beasts. The White House is like, it's the external face. It is the politics of the policy. They're selling the things that the administration is doing. The agencies are doing the things. They're where the nuts and bolts of each policy is being created. That co-op program that I mentioned while I was working at Deloitte, White House wasn't Our client wasn't the White House. It was the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services that was piecing that program together. And so the Department of Justice is, piecing the programs together that, the administration is pursuing and Congress is passing. And just like getting to see how policy is enacted has been, really illuminating in a way that you don't really get to see in the White House. The White House, you're selling it. You're convincing Congress to do something. You're, selling a policy to the American people. But in DOJ, especially in DOJ, you're doing the work. You're implementing policy and hopefully changing people's lives in that way.
Since I was in high school over a decade ago now, it feels like there's been a major shift in where high-achieving Black students want to make an impact in the world. It seemed like all of our eyes back in the day were on medicine, finance, and law. But now, it seems like the next generation's attention is laser-focused on tech and engineering. If you compare how many aspiring STEM majors applied to the Ron Brown Scholarship in my class versus the class that we just welcomed in 2024, the numbers aren't even close. So for recent graduates of top law schools with nearly unlimited options, you really need to love the purpose behind the work you do in the public sector in order to stick with it.
But I do think what draws people to it is this desire to, one, just engage in that kind of like deep analysis and reasoning, and also for a lot of us to make a difference. I mean, you have a chance to really make law. That was what was pretty awesome about the clerkship experience. I mean, you're interpreting the law. Of course, legislatures make the law, but the precedent that you create does guide behavior in society for businesses moving forward. And that is extremely important and a powerful position to be in.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, it is in terms of weight, it is as legislative as anything that happens in Congress.
Especially when we have now legislatures that don't legislate.
Oh, yeah.
Like the Ohio State House. People say, Congress isn't really passing that many bills these days. So unfortunately, in some ways, the judiciary has become all the more important because if they get something wrong, then it's not that easy to just go to Congress and be like, make it better. That might not happen for some time.
There are still plenty of Ron Brown scholars, over 50 as of a couple of years ago, who have chosen to use the law to bring the impact they know the world desperately needs. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Value of One, The Power of All, a podcast created by the Ron Brown Scholar Program. Stay tuned for the third episode of Season 2, where we'll shift from the courts to the impact and insights from scholars through research and academia. If you want to hear more inspiring conversations like this one, don't forget to click subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. And to learn more about the organization, check us out at ronbrown.org.